Greetings, and welcome to Beatles Stuffology. We're two old friends who are around to talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is JG McQuarrie. I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello, how are you?
I am alright, thank you. How are you?
I'm ready to travel. I'm ready to get on the road.
Good. Well, that's handy. We really have to find ways of scripting introductions less corny than this one, but never mind. We're talking about Ticket to Ride this week. So we leave Beatles for Sale in the rearview mirror, and we move on to the intermediate single. So it's a single with quite a lot going on with it, quite a lot to say about it, hopefully. So let's just kick right off. What do you think of Ticket to Ride?
Well, welcome to 1965, I think, is the first thing that we should mention, really. This is the first thing recorded by the Fab Four, if indeed they are still the Fab Four, more of that later, in 1965, after having got all of those recordings for Beatles for Sale out of the way. And it's a breath of fresh air, really, isn't it? It's a nice change in terms of quality, but it's also a change in terms of how the Beatles are going to be recording going forward as well. There's much less sense now of them rehearsing and then going into the studio in order to record. There's much more of a sense of turning up and working on things in the studio, keeping the tapes rolling and being able to hear how a song develops much more. So we have ourselves a bit of a bona fide classic, which is interesting because it sounds both like the Beatles we've had up till now and not like the Beatles we've had up till now. There's a cryptic handover for you.
Lovely, thank you. I love a cryptic handshake. Right, yeah, I mean, it is a breath of fresh air. I think that's a very nice way of putting it. After what has become an increasingly sort of sludgy album towards the end of Beatles for Sale, we did highlight a couple of tracks like What You're Doing that kind of at least suggest a way forward for the band, but nothing that really actually ends up sounding like the way the band will go forward immediately thereafter. Ticket to Ride is no spoilers here, but it's like one of my favorite Beatles songs. I utterly love Ticket to Ride, and just the way that things are suddenly shifted from this slightly worn out, exhausted feeling that kind of dogs a lot of the Beatles for Sale era music through into this, where it's so much more engaged, where there's a real sense of everyone like pulling their weight. There's just this wonderful sense that they're not only could they find a way forward, but they have, and it's just an incredibly dramatic shift from the last actual song we covered, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, which is all right, to this. It's like black and white. The difference is astronomical. So we'll get into that more as we go through, but I utterly adore this song.
So one of the reasons why I like this is that, I suppose it's fourfold, really, in the sense that up till this point, there have been songs in which individual Beatles or pair of Beatles have been more to the forefront. There's been songs where perhaps you might have highlighted McCartney's bass, or the riff that George is playing, or Ringo's drumming, or an aspect of the harmonies. But this is where it seems to all come together for the first time. So just to sort of quickly run through it, and then you can put your spin on all of it. For me, of course it's for me, I'm saying it, it's all about the drums. The drums on this just drives the tune in a way that is absolutely outstanding. But everyone gets their own bit as well. So I think that John is just about at his best vocally on this. I think the low rumbling bass is exemplary. And Paul's harmonies are pretty good too. George is playing that sort of the constant refrain, but then also his tiny little bit that leads us back into the song after the middle eight. Absolutely top-notch stuff. And although some people might sort of say, oh yeah, but it's drawing on things that other people are doing, it's really not. They're getting this first. They're pulling it all together. and pushing it back out onto the world. So yeah, there is that jingly jangly kind of guitar bit that's going on. But remember, bands like the Byrds haven't broken through by this stage. So this is something where they may have picked up some influences from different places, but they have synthesized it and pushed it back out in a way that is the first real sign of the powerhouses that they're going to become.
Yeah, exactly. It's every member of the band doing what they do the best that they can do it. There's a few scattered songs in the Beatles back catalogue where that is true. I mean, Day in the Life is one of the most obvious examples, but I think this is really the first one that does that point forward, whilst at the same time just encapsulate what everybody brings to the table. That chiming introduction on the big 12 string that George plays is so unbelievably memorable. It's one of the most memorable sort of riffs that the Beatles ever come up with. It's incredibly simple. It's basically just an A chord with like one finger moved on it. Like if there was ever a song I was going to get my own guitar out and play, like it might have been this one. I have elected not to, so our listeners can sleep easy at night. But nevertheless, it's such a gloriously simple thing, but it is just beautiful. It just works so perfectly, and that's like the opening few seconds. It's kind of interesting how powerful and how effective that is. It gets quoted all the time musically when people do other cover versions. It's just brilliant. I agree with Lennon's vocal in this. I think it's a really good example of what he can do vocally. I love Paul's harmonies on it. The bass is phenomenal. And then, of course, I mean, you preempted my Ringo praise. But I mean, what else is there to say? I mean, Ringo is just this, from the plodding four on the floor, just keep the offbeat hanging that we've had throughout the last album to this. I mean, it's extraordinary. And it all comes together. Everything about the way that Ringo plays in this, from the tom fills just before My Baby Don't Care, from the way that the slightly staggered rhythm through the verse keeps that drive going. The whole of the verse is just one chord. It's just a simple A chord. But you've got the chiming guitars and you've got Ringo doing this amazing drum pattern. It just holds the whole thing together. It never gets boring and repetitive, even though there's only a scattershot of chords in it. It's just amazing work from him.
He manages to both attack the drums, but attack them in a way that is restrained. So everything there, it's should we say, maximum efficiency, and it gets exactly the right output. It drives the song, but doesn't overtake it. Without that drumming, or with a different pattern that was perhaps more elaborate, the song would go in a different direction. And that's why I think it's so important. It's about knowing what to do for the best effect of the song. And everything in this. We've sort of said it before with a few of the Beatles songs, although perhaps less on the last album. Everything is for the purpose of the song. There's no ego at all in this song. There's no sense of I want my moment here. Everything builds towards making the song something that is overall brilliant.
I completely agree. I think it's a very democratic song in that sense. I also think it's the best produced song we've heard in a very long time. The production of this song is absolutely amazing. George Martin is able to bring that kind of heaviness and that kind of force to the song without it ever seeming oppressive or overwhelming, which is a real skill. I did a kind of close listen between this and the Blue Album 2023 version of this song. I don't really like the 2023 version as much. Now, I'm aware, obviously, I've heard it much less frequently, so, it could simply be the bias of having heard Ticket to Ride for 30 or 40 years and only having heard that a number of times. But one of the things is that the bass is kind of off to the left in the original mix of the song, and the 2023 version kind of moves it into the middle. It gives the bass a bit more depth and a bit more resonance, I suppose, but it undermines exactly what you said. Everything is already perfectly placed, and it becomes slightly oppressive. It becomes slightly too present in the mix, and it feels like it saps a little bit of the energy from that. Whereas just having it perfectly placed in the original mix, it's absolutely within the song, and it's helping to keep McCartney's bass line where it should be. And I don't know, I can't. There are a few mixes on that Blue Album 2023 remaster that are good, but Ticket to Ride isn't one of them. The original is still the best because, again, exactly as you said, everyone is pulling in the direction of the song, and George Martin knows exactly how to produce this. There is nothing sloppy in the way that we saw sometimes on Beatles for Sale, or simply perfunctory. I'll just get it done and get on to the next thing. There's real care and precision. Everything is perfectly placed. It's just phenomenal.
Although there are some live versions that I think work as well, if not better. So we'll talk about for example, the live at the BBC version a little bit later in terms of the context. But I think the performance on it, and particularly the guitar work, it sounds considerably more bluesy, and it's got a feel to it that is a little bit bolder, a little bit braver, because everything on the record is restrained, deliberately restrained in a way that works, but it is also therefore a song that allows them to let loose a little bit when they're playing bits of it live. And I think that also then applies to Paul's harmonies, because I think Paul's harmonies, particularly on things like, in She Don't Care, when they're, he's really yelling that, and I sometimes wonder if that's because he was trying so hard to play a much more straightforward bass line than he would otherwise want to have played. So fine, okay, I'll do this drone-like, to use the word that's often mentioned about this song, I'll do this drone-like bass line, but I am going to put some fun into these vocals and really let go. And there are some live versions where he really lets go on it as well. Well, we haven't mentioned one of the things that I usually mention if I like something musical in the song. I'm very, very cliched. Perfect change of pace in this, because you would imagine that if it had progressed in the same way as the verse all the way through, then it would have worked for some bands. It could have turned into a nice sort of 6-minute piece somewhere down the line later in the 60s, and everybody freaks out. But what we get is that reminder that this is a pop song, and that's why we get that middle eight and that change of tempo. That's why we get that amazing coda at the end to take us out on an amazing high. And I can't help but feel that there could have been a situation whereby one of them thought, well, here's this song that I've got. Right, okay, what else can we add to it? And then they sort of pull in a piece, as they obviously do later in their career. They pull in a piece from a completely different song in order to totally freshen it up. Because the coda really bears no relation musically to what's gone before. I mean, it has a lyrical connection, but not really a musical. It may well be that other people's more attuned ears can hear things that are connected. But by Ekblad, they've really managed to pick something that absolutely worked.
Well, that coda, it's back to the A chord, so it's exactly the same chord as the song opens on, with the chiming guitars, and that I think I'm going to be sad. But rather than this kind of with the Ringo's kind of off-kilter drums underneath it, and this kind of sort of stabbing rhythm, it goes for momentum and builds kind of force that way. So it does cut back to the same chord, but it just goes to show how much you can do with so little, because it doesn't sound, like you say, it doesn't really sound like it's connected, and yet it's great. It's got McCartney's little squiggly lead guitar line over the top of it. It's a great way out of the song. Just to slightly go back.
You say McCartney's lead guitar line over the top of it?
Sorry, Harrison's lead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, just checking.
It's just this great little outro, and I agree with what you were saying with the live material as well. There's it. I think a lot of Beatles live material I don't find all that interesting, except in the sense of it being a historical document, because oftentimes when they perform a song live, it is pretty much just straight studio version. And like a studio version, but played less well and with lots of people screaming over the top of it, isn't that interesting to me. But listening to something like Ticket to Ride and those high McCartney vocals that you mentioned coming in, really driving the song. Like the song feels like it has a different character and personality to it when it's played live as on the record. And that immediately makes it a much more interesting live proposition.
Which is therefore interesting that they did record this in a different way, in a sense that for once they weren't capturing as tightly a band performance, but allowing themselves more time to add overdubs in order to perfect it. And there's one live version, forgive me, I can't remember which one, where you hear George slightly fluff his his little solo, as it were. I think actually it's quite a difficult thing to play. So it's not a surprise that from time to time he's not going to get that 100%. But you can imagine them then being in the studio and getting a really good take, and then perhaps him not everything else about the take being great, that not being great, and they say, okay, George, just play that bit again, and we'll overdub it. So it's taking advantage of different ways of recording, taking advantage of a much more relaxed atmosphere in the studio. And I wonder with that, they're not following a particular career path. No one has laid down a strategy for what happens when you are the biggest recording act in the Western world, where, you have a huge number of number one records, both albums and singles. What do you do? Well, what's everybody else done? Well, Elvis was tightly controlled by Colonel Tom, so they followed a path that was perhaps less creative. But you've got 4 creative people who are pulling in similar directions, who are now exploring different ways of doing things as a result of getting all of that success. And that includes recording in a different way. So that then opens up more opportunities, which in their case led to more success. But that's why we should be grateful that although this pops over 3 minutes, what we haven't done is then gone into the kind of territory that could have alienated their audience. There's still that pop sensibility. It is still at its heart something that you can sing, something that you can hum, something that people can pick up and play. So it has that accessibility to it that is vital to that ongoing success. They're not going to go from being pop heroes into cult heroes. In fact, I would say that's pretty much true of most of their career. They can manage to produce intelligent pop and rock records without alienating too many people. And it's a wonderful thing that they can do this, because it's not that far removed from some of their absolutely massive hits of the last 18 months. And yet it is also massively removed from their hits of the last 18 months. And that just makes it almost a work of genius.
Well, absolutely. And one of the things that makes that obvious, I think, is there is such a sheer joy about this song as well. There is just a sense that you can kind of tell that they know that this is something special. This is so much better than what they've done before. But yeah, I completely agree about the sort of pop sensibility. I think it's interesting. The first week that this song went to number 1 in the singles charts, the song the Stones have in that chart is The Last Time, and the song the Who have is I Can't Explain. Those are both interesting songs in their own way. I don't think either of them is as good as Ticket to Ride, but you can see that pop sensibility. I Can't Explain is heavier. It's certainly more raucous than Ticket to Ride is, and it's interesting to see the charts start to shift in that direction. And the Beatles aren't exactly playing catch up, but they're also just like you said, there's no template for this. There's no way forward. There's nothing else as compared to it. You can, it's easy to say, well, Elvis or even Sinatra, in terms of like massive, world dominating recording stars, but there just isn't a meaningful comparison because neither of them are writers, and obviously neither of them are a band. Why? What a deep observation that is. But it does push things in different directions. And one of the most blissful things about Ticket to Ride is the way that it is able to incorporate other things which both exist in the wild, but which also only really exist in this song. It's such a fascinating snapshot of an era. Like you started this episode by saying welcome to 1965, but yeah, really, welcome to 1965.
Yeah. When was the last time put out? Was it before, after? Because actually, the last time is probably it was recorded a month before, but hey, fair enough. That's one of my favourite Stone songs.
It's a great song.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's interesting because that also has that sort of the power chord running through it. So it's kind of that. What we're going to do is we're going to emphasise the repetition of something. So that's really interesting. But of course, the last time is relatively flat lyrically, and I don't think you get a great sense of emotion coming from Jagger other than that sort of sneering element. Whereas you do get a sense of Lennon's joy in his performance. They really, as you said, that sense that they know that they're on to something good. But what I find interesting about this is that if you look at the song as a song, and you can sort of then pick lots of different bits and talk about how amazing this bit, how amazing that bit is, I think we're again into the territory where I would say don't look at the lyrics too closely. But I'll mention a little bit more about that in a moment. But the phrase itself, Ticket to Ride, is a very, very clever one that has, of course, stayed in public consciousness, partially because of the board game. The board game is an absolutely massive hit and has had lots of different iterations as well. So there's that huge success there. But it's one of those phrases that is so rare in sense of it being a new phrase that has just entered the lexicon. So, for example, today's newspaper, we are on the 2nd of March 2024. On the front page of The Guardian, at the bottom, they have a couple of shortened headlines that reflect some of the content that's inside. One of them is a story about how rail fares in the UK are due to go up, and they've been going up and up. Let's not get into that. And the little snappy headline they've used to draw you into page 2 to read the full article, Tickets to Rise.
There you go.
There you go. And it just so happened that was there today. And it's that perfect example of how something has lived in lots of different forms. That is an indication of the lyrical cleverness that exists. However, as usual, don't assume that lyrical cleverness runs throughout the entire song, or that if you listen to the entire song and actually think about all of the words, that it's one, consistent, or two, actually says what you think it says. Because, what does it all mean? Well, say again, be honest, folks, the lyrics sound great as long as you don't look too closely. Because this song could be a celebration of female independence. But I would find it hard to say that the I of the song, and the I of the song may not be John, there may just be a bunch of words he's put together, but I would find it hard to say that the I of the song is delighted by her newfound independence. And if she's driving him mad, why is he bothered by her leaving? And how might she do right by him as well? What's all that about? So here's the thing: if you want to hold Lennon up as a prototype, as a disciple perhaps of Dylan at this stage, you have to be prepared to look a little more closely at the lyrics. And I think they only hold up to scrutiny if you don't scrutinise them and just leave them with their great association with the melody and the harmony, because it's how they're sung, it's how they're harmonised that makes these great lyrics, not the actual words themselves. If you want to celebrate the genius of Lennon, then that's the genius to celebrate, not the actual poetry, if you like, because lyrically it just doesn't compare. And I would urge listeners to remind themselves of Dylan's All I Really Want to Do, which was from, I think, November 1964, for something that is lyrically complex and warm and in the message in terms of relationships between men and women, it's light years ahead of where Lennon is. But that's okay, because that's a very repetitive song that takes you on a journey through the words. Ticket to Ride is a repetitive song that takes you on a journey in several different directions through a combination of the music, the singing, and the bits of the lyrics that you can pick out to hum to at any point. There you go. There's my lyrical piece.
I think that's perfectly fair. And, I think essentially what you're arguing is that the lyrics here are almost sort of impressionistic. They give an impression of something. You don't need to stare at them too closely in order to have them resolve into a specific image, but the impressions that they leave is what matters.
This is not Ferris Bueller staring into the Surat painting in the gallery in Chicago. In fact, I can't remember if it was the Ferris Bueller character or whether it was one of the others. But you know what I mean, where you go closer and closer and closer to the point where you end up seeing pixels, effectively, little tiny splodges of paint. We don't need to go that deep. It's pop music. It's not meant to, at this stage, be an art form, and we do risk. I mean, we risk it by talking about it every couple of weeks. But we risk taking something that is towards the high end of popular culture, mass culture, and venerating it in a way that isn't intended. It's fine. Enjoy it for what it is. Look as deep as you want to go, and then pull out, move on to something else. Because you know what? 3 minutes time, there's another song coming along.
Yes, it is. And yes, it is. Excellent. Thank you. I agree with you up to a point.
There's a but coming.
Yeah, there is a but coming. But I also think that if you want to talk about the transition from sort of popular music as simply disposable culture and having it develop into something which can be regarded more as an art form, then I think Ticket to Ride is one of the pivot points where you can actually achieve this. Not, I think, lyrically, but I think musically and in terms of its production, as we were discussing before. There just isn't really anything like this around at the time. There isn't anything which is quite managing to capture the different recording techniques, the different production techniques, the everybody at their absolute peak of creativity, and the vocals. It's kind of a unique piece, and there is a phase where music does start to transition away from that more simplistic pop. Obviously, we already have Dylan riding that kind of wave. There are plenty of other artists coming forward now as well, and this is the Beatles' kind of first attempt to kind of be in that oeuvre, if you like. There is something in the way that it's overdubbed. There is something in the way that this has been produced, that it's not just a live performance captured on tape, that really does push into new territory. And that's how art forms develop. You don't just jump from Heartbreak Hotel to I Am the Walrus with nothing in between. And this is the something in between. And I think it does indicate, as at the very least, signpost the start of that transition towards music not simply being disposable.
My point is more on the lyrical side of it, really.
On the lyrical side, yes, absolutely.
I think that's the crucial element, because let's face it, lyrically, people find it much easier to associate with particular songs. People are much more likely to write their lyrics on there, and when we were at school, write down a snippet of a lyric in the inside back cover of your exercise book than you were to write down musical notation. And it's much easier, I think, for lots of people to talk about lyrics than it is to talk about why they like something musically, and that tends to be the basis of, or has historically been the basis of, a lot of music reviews as well. So there are some sophisticated things that are starting to emerge from here. So, for example, the repetition within a line, so she ought to think twice, she ought to do right by me. I think that lends a certain punch and a certain pace. I don't necessarily like the construction of it, because she ought to think twice, she ought to do right sounds really kind of like that Lennon character, pleading and that desperation. I think it's a slightly odd choice, but I do like the fact that you've got that driving rhythm through the words, through that repetition of the first part of a phrase. So it's possible to start looking at it and thinking, there's bits here that are really good. Oh yeah, there's really kind of poetic. But I think in our heart of hearts, we would have to say that it's a first step on a way to something that is a little bit more sophisticated, but we're still stuck in the realm of the John character, who is a bit of an annoying git.
Well, we're going to see a lot of that transition moving forward as we move into the Help album. So it's going to be very interesting to explore that kind of thing. But again, the mere fact that we can look at this and say, it is a comparatively simple lyric, but it's still streets ahead of almost anything on Beatles for Sale, maybe with the exception of No Reply as far as Lennon's concerned. But it feels like it's going somewhere. It feels like he's kind of got a handle on something and a sense of the direction. I do think that's also reflected in his performance. We touched on it earlier on, but it's a great performance from Lennon with this. He's not just standing up and singing it. He's performing it, and it makes all the difference in the world.
I mean, he may actually really believe in the words that he's singing, but I sure as heck don't think he knows what it is that he's actually singing about, whether he wants this person back or he wants her to be free, and why he wants her to be back if she's annoying him, and the fact that she doesn't care. I mean, there are so many kind of like join up the dots, and that's sort of the point. Don't look for consistency because there is none, and that's okay, because he sings it really, really well. It sounds more convincing than it actually is, and that's great. That's absolutely great. A really good performance can actually elevate relatively simple, straightforward lyrics, and it can make you see things in it that perhaps aren't there. Because, there's all kinds of stories. Dear listener, you probably want us to discuss whether this is actually about some trip to ride on the Isle of Wight, or whether it's about German prostitutes or whatever. But, to use a phrase I use, slightly regret using in the last episode about the potential Beatles films, because I can realise that our many dozens of listeners will sort of be turned off by it. I don't really care what the inspiration for this actually was. It doesn't really matter to me. If you want to take it as either of those stories, great. Doesn't matter. Just like it doesn't really matter whether it was 60-40 John Paul, 75-25, 90-10, whether they wrote it together as Paul suggests, or whether John wrote it and Paul added the ideas for the drum. It doesn't really matter, does it? And except perhaps to some people who are uber completists, and let's face it, they're going to go see those films whether or not I say I don't care. They're not going to be influenced by me.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I suppose we should touch on the authorship of it, really, given that, as is often the way with Lennon, there do seem to be two different versions of what he thinks. There's the one that he talked about. Well, let's stick to two for the time being, lest we get overwhelmed. Our attempts to do this episode as a tight 30 have already drifted by, incidentally. But yeah, let's go with two, and say, originally, he conceded in the 60s that McCartney had contributed a fair amount to it, and then in his inevitable Playboy interview in 1980, he seemed to think that was much, much less the case, and that McCartney had contributed very little. It's Lennon. Maybe he is, retroactively trying to claim more credit for something, which is definitely a Lennon song. Let's not have any bones about that. Whether he's just self-mythologizing again and trying to build his own kind of image up, or there's no way of knowing, other than if we take McCartney's word for it, which is McCartney seems to agree with the original statement that Lennon made, which is that, there's he contributed a decent amount, but it's still, mostly a Lennon song. So, no, take your pick, really.
At some point, maybe there's thought for a conversation about musical authorship anyway, isn't there? Because there's the person that writes the song, but then how much of the arrangement or the decisions about how it's played in the studio actually then contribute to the overall authorship. That's fair enough. But I suppose the other point about that is that there was a term for, REM where Peter Buck would come up with stories and they talk about him being in Buckland. And I think Lennon's probably one of the original inspirations for that, in that he wasn't necessarily consistent in interviews, and it depended on how he felt, what mood he was in, the depth of the therapy he was going through at the time. And there's not necessarily 100% certainty about how much he was A, telling the truth, and B, knew he was telling the truth. It's fine. He may have just been playing with roles in a way that he did. So, for example, with he's often thought of as having referred to this as being the first heavy metal record. I'm not sure he actually did say that. I mean, he did call it heavy for then, which I suppose it was, but don't know if he really would, even if he had said it was the first heavy metal record, whether he would have believed that, or whether he was just being, mischievous, playful, or even possibly trying to stake a claim for influences that maybe weren't there. Because everyone in public eye, people always try and rewrite their own role in the grand scheme of things. So it's fine. It was an influence, and it was a heavy record compared to a lot of others that were going on. It wasn't heavy metal, but I think he knew that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And trying to position yourself as influential is an entirely understandable thing for, a writer in his position to do. But on the other hand, he's the Beatles. Like, there isn't really an aspect of modern music that isn't in some way, the influence doesn't have to be firsthand, but, they are, I think, probably without question, the most influential group of all time. I would be surprised if that was open to contradiction, but it's fine. I'm sure this might well have. I mean, you can hear other influences in this. Again, we're back to the old chiming 12 string, but there's plenty of influence to go around, and if it's not meant literally, that's fine. It can still be an influence and not be literally the first heavy metal record, because it's very clearly not.
So, and actually, that in itself is an interesting point, and that maybe that's where we can sort of develop this into other areas as well. Because when people talk about something being like the Beatles or Beatle-esque, they're not really in the main talking about 62 to 64, possibly the odd exception. But when, say, Tears for Fears did Sowing the Seeds of Love, when, Oasis were producing records, when lots of those bands, World Party, I've been listening to a lot recently, really enjoying, you may sort of be able to see those cultural touchstones of the 60s and say the Beatles, but you're not talking about 62 to 64. You're really talking about, say, 65 onwards, perhaps even more 66 onwards. But this is the start of that era that people will recognise in the influences that are formed over the next few details. And in some respects, this was, so caveat time. You could probably look at any historical period and be able to pick out something that marks the passing of one era, supposedly, and then the influence of a new era coming in. But there are a couple of biggies around this time, early 65. So, there could have been things. So, the Conservatives who've been in power since, about 51, lost the election towards the end of 64. It was tight. The Labour won by 4. And then it took them another 18 months to build up the confidence to then go for another general election in which they got a much bigger majority. But that in itself was a big thing, because we go from Alec Douglas Hume, Lord Hume, who'd had to give up his peerage to become Prime Minister, who'd effectively been appointed by Tory grandees. They'd been through a few Prime Ministers. I don't know if that rings any bells with anyone who's up to speed with the last 2 years of British politics. And you have the much younger, the much brasher Harold Wilson becoming Prime Minister. Early 65, Winston Churchill dies, which is a massive thing. And then for those of you who, like your football, and if you know about, English football history, Stanley Matthews, one of the legends of the English game, so much so there's a famous match played that is named after him. He played his last match. But not only did he play his last match, but actually, and here's where you can then sort of see that old and the new. He played his last match aged 50. 50. Played until he was 50. That's just how legendary he was. But actually on the 1st of January, he was the first ever footballer to be knighted. Now it's a little bit more common. You get a few more. But just imagine that. I can almost imagine what people would have said. Oh, a footballer? Ooh, not sure about that. Oh, no, that's a working class sport. People like that don't get knighthoods. So, I mean, that's a fascinating thing, a fascinating little shift that one era closes, another one, I wouldn't say it's rushing in, but they're chipping away. Early 65, you get Malcolm X visiting the West Midlands after there had been some riots in Smethwick. You get a comedy programme starting, which might sound really dated now, but Round the Horn, at the time, really pushed boundaries. Not least, as I'm sure people will say, in terms of its use of Polari. So it's almost like this subversive promotion of this move, recognition of homosexual slang. Bearing in mind that in 64, homosexuality was still illegal, and it was the Wilson government. I'm sure there'll be lots of people who say that lots of things wrong, lots of people that might defend it, but one of the things that happened during their that reign, if you like, 64 to 70, was some element of decriminalisation of homosexuality. So there are shifts that are starting to happen, and it's possible that the Beatles themselves are reflecting, but also being part of those shifts starting to develop. Because it's not that long now before the Beatles themselves end up on an honours list as well. But we get, from what I can see as well, two distinct indications of that shift in the Beatles coming up during 65, and I'd link them to Ticket to Ride, because in May 65, 26th of May it's recorded but broadcast on the 7th of June, the Beatles make their last quote-unquote live appearance on BBC Radio. And BBC Radio had been a massive thing in terms of getting them out there. This was their 52nd appearance like this on the BBC. They had dedicated programmes to them. And, even towards the tail end of 64, the second half of 64, there's about 5 or 6 of these. But after the release of Beatles for Sale, there's nothing through to this, and this is the last one. The significance in relation to Ticket to Ride is that the Beatles decided they didn't want it to be called From Us to You, which the last few had been called. And instead we've got The Beatles Invite You to Take a Ticket to Ride. Horrible, horrible title. However, you can see that the influence that A Ticket to Ride then is having. And I'll just read you the 7 songs they recorded for it. They recorded, and you'll see again how we're kind of shifting very slightly. We've still got our foot in the Mop Top era, as we know they're going to have live for a little while. Yeah, we have A Ticket to Ride. That is honestly the best song they recorded. Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, I'm a Loser, The Night Before, Honey Don't, Dizzy Miss Lizzie, She's a Woman. So you've got The Night Before, okay, fair enough. I'm a Loser, okay, fair enough. Ticket to Ride, yay. And some of those covers that we love so much. That's really interesting that's the set list that they chose. And I'm looking at this from 2024, and I have no particular knowledge of this, but that kind of screams to me of we're just going to play some of our live set because we know that, we play that on a regular basis. We don't have to put too much thought into it. What they're not doing is playing a bunch of stuff from the movie or playing a bunch of stuff from the album Help. They're not sort of looking forward. they're mostly looking back. And then on the 14th of August, Ticket to Ride is also part of their last studio appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, which, let's face it, has made them in America. That, they were going to do well. They were number one when they landed, for goodness sake. Or in fact, they were number one when they were in Paris, doing all those shows in Paris. So they'd already hit number one in America. But the projection that they had through the Ed Sullivan Show just made them absolutely monumental. Mount Rushmore type figures, if you like. And again, they did play some of the older tracks, but they also played, well, I Feel Fine, that was one of the older tracks, but Yesterday and Help as well. I think that suggests they had slightly more respect for the Ed Sullivan Show than they did towards the BBC radio. And I wonder if they sort of felt like they'd outgrown the radio just through the choices of those songs. But I think it's interesting. You can sure cut years all different ways, but I think there is that sense of we're moving from this to this. Perhaps even we're moving from the early 1960s into what people regard as, quote unquote, the 60s.
I think when it comes to the choice of tracks that they perform live as well, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of commerciality either. I mean, by the time they're on Ed Sullivan, plugging the movie is important. So of course, Help is going to get an outing. But also, it's just much more interesting material to play. It's far more varied. It's not just plodding through the same kind of stuff that they've done, since the Hamburg days. Yes, there's still a few stragglers which are hanging on in there. But yeah, of course, you want to engage with the stuff that you're doing now. It makes perfect sense that you would want to have that opportunity to not only explore the material that you are happiest with that you're doing in the moment, but also the kind of thing that you have with the new material. And we're getting to that point where the Beatles' ability to perform the songs that they have is going to outstrip their abilities that's actually the wrong way around, isn't it? Their ability to record songs is going to outstrip their ability to perform them live. And we're now at that threshold. We're at the point where what can be done in the studio is something which is not easily replicatable upon the stage. So, it's great that they're playing Help. It's great that they're playing Ticket to Ride. But these are really the last songs. This is really almost the last gasp of the kind of songs they can do live. There'll be plenty of stuff on Rubber Soul that's also the case of. And then after that, it's going to be a struggle. And even some of the material on Rubber Soul, they're not going to be doing much in the way of live versions of Norwegian Wood, for example. So it's another sort of transitional state, but the fact that we are hitting that state where what they're recording is noticeably more sophisticated than they can achieve on stage it's another passing, it's another transition.
Just to preview something that listeners will hear in about 3 years' time, Norwegian Wood, there's another Lennon song that is lyrically vastly overrated.
Something to look forward to there.
Yeah. God, it feels like we've really sort of gone to town on this one, doesn't it? And yet there's more, isn't it? Because I know we obviously started talking about covers and all good points. We started talking about live things, and again, all good points. But there is also the need to cover the covers. Yeah, there's a problem, I think, that comes with this song, in that this song is so idiosyncratically Beatles that I think it's really hard for someone to do a cover unless they make significant changes. Otherwise, they're doing a copy, which is fine if they're if it's someone who is vocally strong in a particular way. But there is a risk that you can just end up sounding like the Beatles in another genre. which is a little bit of a worry. So what have you got in terms of the covers?
So a couple that kind of stood out to me. One is Beatle friend, cohort, and extramarital lady Alma Cogan. We love a bit of Alma. Her version is kind of interesting in that it's incredibly jaunty. It's very upbeat, and it's got this kind of running piano kind of thread underneath it. It has something about it which I find genuinely fascinating, because it's not the only cover version that does this. There's also the version by Vanilla Fudge, which does the same thing. Vanilla Fudge isn't, I don't think they're all that well known a band anymore, but they're kind of like a bluesy stoner sort of band from the 60s. And both of those cover versions, and the Carpenters cover version does it as well, they drop the arpeggiated riff. Arguably the most distinctive thing about the song, the ding intro. Well, it's interesting because it's so unbelievably distinctive, yet it just gets dropped. Now, admittedly, certainly the Carpenters and the Alma Cogan version, they're on piano, but there's no reason that you couldn't replicate that on a piano rather than a guitar and give it a different feel. Yeah, the Carpenters version is kind of interesting because it slows it down. It makes it slightly more melancholic. I like that approach, but I don't particularly like the Carpenters cover version. I don't think it's very effective. It's a bit maudlin. It's trying a bit too hard. I don't know. It doesn't really work for me.
I think you like it if you like the Carpenters. It works in that respect. I think it's very difficult to come along as perhaps someone who might like a different style of music. Who doesn't really like a lot of the Carpenters' back catalogue. It's not going to be the song that draws you in. I think it's for the fans, man.
That's fair enough.
In terms of the, I suppose the point I was making, there's an Echo and the Bunnymen B-side, I think, that just doesn't get far enough away from the original. The riff and the melody are just too distinct, and they keep playing that as well. And I think however much you try and dress it up, however much you try and have some attitude, it just sounds like a Beatles song, but in a slightly different genre. And that's why it doesn't really work for me. There's a Bee Gees cover that does dampen down the guitar riff, but the singing, the harmonies are really very similar to the originals. So there's not enough that marks it out as being distinct. That's the point at which you might as well have kept the guitar part in and gone for the copy. And by the way, the Bee Gees are going to become an increasingly rich source of covers for us throughout the remainder of the Beatles' career, because there is a point in the early and mid 70s where the Bee Gees go absolutely nuts for Beatles covers. That's worth holding on to. In fact, it's worth looking up on YouTube. You can find plenty of clips of them doing various covers, even some when they were still pretty young and possibly even still in Australia. Fascinating stuff. Absolutely fascinating.
Well, I was going to say something to look forward to then, but I suppose that very much depends on one's attitude towards the Bee Gees.
Stick with fascinating.
Let's go with that. And there is a word lurking around the periphery here, which I have been trying to avoid in our discussion, sort of along the cover version.
Tick.
Thank you. Quintessential. I think one of the things about Ticket to Ride, one of the reasons that it is so inescapable and so hard to do a convincing cover version of, is that it is one of the most quintessential Beatles songs that there is. It's there with She Loves You. It's there with All You Need Is Love. It's that level of quintessential. It distills everything that the upcoming era really is going to be, and it does it in one song, and it pretty much just does it perfectly.
Okay, well, that sounds like that was wrapping things up, unless there were other things that you wanted to mention. I mean, we could mention the Fun in the Snow, for example, We could mention the uninterested video of the Beatles sitting in their directors' chairs, Ringo standing up drumming in front of enlarged tickets with some fairly poor miming, I think, in
Very
one
poor.
take of it. Wasn't Ticket to Ride what the Beatles were seen playing in that now mostly lost episode of Doctor Who?
It's not mostly lost. It completely exists. It's episode 1 of The Chase, and yeah, it is exactly that. It's a clip of them playing Ticket to Ride on Top of the Pops. The original plan had been to try and get the Beatles in, and do them as kind of old men at some point. So the Doctor travelled forward and met the Beatles in their old age. But Brian Epstein decided that was not a good idea, and I got to say, I'm probably a big Doctor Who fan, though I may well be. I got to say, I'm on Brian Epstein's side for that one.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, but those sort of links are quite interesting. The only thing that really stands out for me in terms of the clip from Help with the fun in the snow bit, well, there's two things. One, Paul sitting on the snow, turning around every so often and just occasionally pressing a key on the piano for no apparent reason, I think is great fun. But also, I'm not sure who it is, but one of them's wearing the top hat, which looks great, and it's even better because it reminds me of an early 80s John Cusack film called Better Off Dead, in which Curtis Armstrong, who plays his sidekick weirdo friend, spends a lot of that film wearing a top hat, and there's a skiing scene in that. I'm pretty sure he's skiing in a top hat as well, so I'm going to pretend that that's an homage to Help. Curtis Armstrong, of course, that people may be aware, was also then the sidekick in Moonlighting, which has been mentioned before on this pod as well, and probably will be mentioned again at some point.
Yes, I think the chances of that are exceedingly high. Yeah.
So we've gone from you providing a perfect summation of this to then us waffling on for a few more minutes. So congratulations. Excellent. If you've managed to stick around, because what you are sticking around for really is to hear JG say the word 10 and for me to say the word 8, and then we're gonna wrap up, and yeah, that's basically it. So I presume you're going to say the word 10.
I'm actually going to say the word 9.5, and I'm not just doing that to be contrary.
4 words.
Okay, well, I'm going to say those words, but yeah, I'm gonna go with a 9.5 in this one. I just think it's one of the most glorious things, and that the half point is simply to give me somewhere to go on a very small number of other tracks. But it's just it is in almost every sense perfect. I just adore Ticket to Ride.
It's the best all round thing so far. There have been better moments. And bits of songs that are just as good, and moments that just really take your breath away. But in terms of all round cultural artifact, this is the Mutt's Nuts at the moment. But Mutt's Nuts only get 8 out of 10 because there are bigger Mutt's Nuts, bigger Mutts and bigger nuts to come.
Lovely. Well, I think we can all look forward to as many nuts as one can possibly. I'm going to stop this right now. Okay, lovely. Well, thanks for that. Well, you can, of course, as always, really get a hold of us. We are Beatles Stuffology. I had to think about that for a second as if I couldn't remember our own name. It's been a long episode. Right, you can contact us by email. We are still BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We are on whatever is left of Twitter at Beatles_ology. And we are just Beatles Stuffology on Instagram. You can find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot, and you can check out my other podcast too, which is Talking Trek to You, where a noob and an expert, which is allegedly me, go through the original 1960s Star Trek series episode by episode. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcast you're using so that more people can find the show. We love a good review, and we'd be very grateful if you would leave us one. Next episode, it's time to flip the disc, and we will talk about the B-side, which is Yes It Is. But until then, keep listening.